Two, I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Building Board of Appeals and Examiners for February 21st, 2012. Meeting is being called at 6:02 p.m. Meeting is being held at the Municipality of Anchorage Building Safety Building on Elmore Road in the training room on the north end of the building. Would you, Madam Secretary, could you please make a roll call?
Sure. Troy Feller,
Here.
Craig Frieden,
Here.
Sterling Strait,
Present.
John Steele,
Here.
Rob Merchant,
Here.
Skip Bringman,
Here.
Barry Gray,
Here.
Tom Looney, Paul Michelson,
Here.
Scott Boney.
Here. It appears that we have 10 of the 11 members. We do have our quorum, so the meeting, the board may conduct business as stated. On the agenda, I would like to switch the agenda just around a little bit. I would like to accept a motion for approval of the minutes from May 13th, 2011. And we'll get that out of the way first, and then we'll go into the agenda, if that's okay with everybody.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr.
I
Steele.
move for approval of the May 13, 2011 minutes.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
We have a second. Any problems with, I've read the minutes, and from what I can remember from a year ago, they appear to be in order. Does anybody else have any comments?
There's a misspelling of my last name on one of the pages.
We'll get that corrected, Mr. Steele.
Thank you.
Do you have a reference to what page that might be?
Let me,
Page 4, about 2/3 of the way down.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Hearing none, seeing none, the minutes from May 13th, 2011 are approved. I'm seeking a motion for approval of the agenda for tonight's meeting. Mr. Steele?
I move for approval of the agenda with the modification of approval of minutes coming first.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Do I see a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. Any other changes or comments board members want to make per the agenda? Hearing none, seeing none, the agenda is approved at this time. The reason for the meeting tonight is for two reasons. Under special orders of business, A is AO 2012-19 Building Board Ordinance. The ordinance, I believe, was submitted by Assemblyman Trombley, who I see is present at this time. And we have several individuals in the audience that are here, I assume, to testify on one of these. The second item, B, is proposed change to the Administrative Code 23.10.105 to clarify license requirements. We're going to cover A first. I'd ask those that are in favor of the ordinance to please speak first, and then we'll have those that oppose, will have a chance afterwards. I'm going to limit, for the sake of time, testimony. Mr. Trombley, I'd like to give you about 8 to 10 minutes to explain your spiel. And then after that, we'll give those in favor of the ordinance about 3 to 4 minutes apiece. Mr. Steele.
Mr. Chairman, if I, maybe before we start
I'm going to let them.
any hearing, I was wondering if we maybe could get a introduction as to what the board is being asked to do. I assume
From the
this
building
being an
official.
assembly business, it's just to offer a perspective from the board.
Thank you for that, Mr.
Is that
Steele.
correct?
At this time, I'd like to ask the building official to please give us a synopsis of what you're asking this board for tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What's before you is ordinance 201219. It was introduced at the Assembly on February the 14th. Originally scheduled for public hearing on the 28th, but at the last meeting the public hearing was moved to March 13th. You might want to make a note of that. The ordinance came to us We had some information from Ms. Tucker at the end of the year that she was working with Mr. Trombley, late December, to make some changes to the way the building board operated. We got the ordinance about the end of January, met with Mr. Trombley a little bit about it, and then the schedule was set, it would go to the assembly on the 14th. So, out of concern that you folks had a chance to have input to it, we asked Mr. Chair to call a special meeting so we could present it also to the board. The ordinance does changes the composition, the purpose, scope, and authority of the building board. The significant changes are Section 1 amends Title 4, sort of procedural thing that matches the other changes, which is to increase the board from 11 to 15 members. In Section 2, the ordinance amends Title 23, Part 10, 103. It brings some language, some of the jurisdiction language that's currently in AMCR 2310, which I believe you all have a copy of that too. We sent that to you. It's your rules of procedure. It brings some of that forward into code, which is actually, as a rule, the way the assemblies, the way the administration is wanting to go, more of the regulations coming into the actual code. We don't necessarily have any issues with that philosophy. And that's part of what this does, is bring jurisdiction into the actual code. But then it adds powers to grant variances in the strict application of the building code. It establishes up to 5 3-member hearing panels, which will hear appeals of decisions of an administrative official or another enforcement order, and allows for de novo appeals before the entire building board, meaning if the small boards of appeals, the 3-member panels, if the board wished to hear the case amongst the whole board, the board could decide it wanted to do that. Or I presume if the person who presented the case to the 3-member panel was unhappy with that decision, they could then bring it before the board, the full board. So it has language in there to allow for that. Lists variance standards and expands the limits of authority of the board to allow waiving the requirements of code if variance standards are met. And again, increases the board from 11 to 15 members, establishes the quorum for hearing panel, voting requirements, reduces the appeal fee from $500 to $100, and makes that totally refundable unless the appellant fails to appear or participate. Right? So that's sort of that's the bones of the ordinance. We have spent quite a lot of time talking it through and researching previous building board practice, and we have several concerns. First, there does not appear to be a demonstrated need for the changes. The board has already the purpose of hearing appeals of the decisions of the administration or the administrative officials, and for interpretations of technical code. So it's already in code for if a person is unhappy with the decision and feels that we've interpreted the code incorrectly, they can bring their appeal to the board for their consideration. The way that in current code, the way that's done is a person files a form, a single-page form. There's a fee of $500, which can be waived if the person has indigent circumstances. Code allows specifically for waiver of that fee. And then once the appeal is in, we call a meeting of the board, and you convene to hear the case. We have doing some research. The last appeal was actually that we could find from talking to Ms. Gonzalez and going through all the records was February 15th, 2007. So we don't have a lot of inquiries. Occasionally someone will say, well, I think I'm going to take it to the building board, we can't work it out. Somehow we always seem to work it out. So that we believe that everyone is working in spirit of cooperation to keep things moving and get things answered. Second concern is that the proposed ordinance, and this is one of the most serious changes for us, is that it allows the building board to grant variances from the code, which undermines the primary intent and purpose of the code. As many of you know, we serve on code development committees. It's the code development procedure for local amendments is very inclusive. It's very painstaking, it takes a lot of time, there's lots of opportunities for people to have input, sit on committees, and be heard if they have a concern about a particular provision of the code. And then within that code review group, which is made up of quite, I think most of the panels are probably a couple dozen people, a fairly important decision is made whether or not to accept particular provisions of the national code. But one provision of the international code that's right up front is that the administrative provision specifically prohibits policies and procedures that have the effect of waiving requirements of the code. You'll find out about the IBC and the IRC. That's where it all begins. And for that, provisions of the code now to be overturned by 2 members of a 3-member panel diminishes the rest of the whole process, in our opinion. And we have serious concern about that. Another concern we have, should this ordinance be passed, is the municipality's insurance services organization rating, also known as ISO, and our working relationship with enforcement agencies of the state of Alaska are in large part based on the extent to which we adhere to the code and how consistent we are in enforcing it. We just went through an ISO interview. They happen about once every 5 years this last year. And I'll ask if they want to see your codes. The examiner wants to see the codes, and he will tell you, you're rated highly on how current you are with code, for one thing, and then how precisely you follow it. Secondly, we have the working relationship with the State of Alaska Department of Labor's Code Enforcement Inspection Group and the State Fire Marshal's Office. And both of those agencies have deferred the Anchorage enforcement to us on the basis of that we're doing a pretty good job of taking care of business. And if the proposed ordinance is enacted and now variances are brought forward, each of those variants will have to be vetted against state standard, because we also know in Title 23 that provisions of the code shall not be deemed to nullify any provisions of local, state, or federal law. So we'll have to take all of these fields. The variance is now going to be presumed and vet that against the state requirements. And some appeals may not even get out of the chute if they conflict with state code. So that will be something we really have to work out. And we've had preliminary, all this has come out rather quickly, we've had some preliminary conversations with both those state officers, and both are quite concerned of how they would work with us on a deferral basis. The standards themselves, the proposed variance standards themselves are fairly broad and allow financial hardship as a reason to waive code. First variance standard is it does not adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the people of Anchorage. That can be seen in many different lights, and we don't feel that if you go to some of the other variances standards that we have, there's very specific tests that a issue must meet before it can be deemed to be worthy of a variance. And secondly, undue hardship, including but not limited to financial hardship, would result from strict compliance with specific requirements. This to us is really opens a Pandora's box. Who's to say how much hardship is sufficient financial hardship? How much it puts the people hearing these variances in quite a position to decide is it a really financial hardship, or does the person just doesn't want to spend money? So that's a question that the board members hearing the variances would have to address. And also, current code already provides the ability to recognize in practical situations without diminishing the integrity of the code. If you've been provided with excerpts 2310, 103, 310 modifications, and also 311, alternative materials, design, and methods of construction and equipment. We have frequently requests for something where the strict part of the code is impractical. And we use these codes, and if you open my book, it goes to it by itself. It goes to that page. And some of you have been in my office and I've referenced it. And yes, we can do this because we feel that it does meet the guidelines of the modifications and the alternative material and methods clauses. We try very hard to use that just as far as we go. We will bend it and bend it, but we won't break it. We will not, keep going away from the code. The health, life safety, and structural requirement, life and fire safety and structural requirements. If those are not compromised, my golly, we'll keep you out the door and down the road, keep you building, and that's what we're gonna do. So we feel that the mechanism is there, and that if a person feels we haven't received properly, again, they can appeal to you as a board. Finally, the problem we have with the changing an appeal so that essentially it wouldn't cost you anything, you'd have to put down a $100 deposit, and then as long as you showed up for the hearing, you would get that deposit back. So that makes it cost zero to the applicant. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, but hey, you don't have to venture anything, so let's give it a go. We're concerned that that would really increase the number of appeals that we would see. That person would tend to want to roll the dice more often, especially if the standards have been relaxed to the point that a very broad standard can be applied, and their odds of being granted variance have increased quite a lot. So that's a concern to us, because every one of these appeals takes time and money to service, if you will. Staff has to do research, provide you with information to hear the appeal. We have to put together all the packets. We have to take staff to be here to answer questions that you may have. That's the overtime cost. In addition to time it takes away from in the regular course of duties. If a staff plan reviewer or an inspector needs to write up a case, we estimate, even on the simple ones, 2 to 4 hours of time just putting the case together, plus time spent at the meeting. And that's time that they're not reviewing plans, that they're not out at an inspection, that we're not hearing modifications, requests, or whatever, because we're getting ready to service another appeal. And as most of you know, our budget is already screwed down to the very last thread. There is nothing left. We have already been trying to get additional permit tech, or additional plan review, so that we can shorten some of those lines out there. And for us to have to absorb this anticipated additional extra caseload, if you will, without any revenue to set off the cost of that, and being able to hire more people, is the only way it'll be taken up is in delays, and other work will have to wait until the appeal cases get sorted out. So those are the problems we see. We are concerned. We're not making any bones about it. We see this as very problematic, and our recommendation is that the board affirm that the current code is written, viable, and research.
Thank you for your overview, Ms. Walsh. Can I just ask you 3 questions real quick here, just for the sake of the people, I think the board members. In your knowledge, has the fee, because you mentioned that the fee has been or can be waived, has the $500 fee ever been waived?
Since I've been in this seat, we haven't had an appeal, so I can't speak to it personally.
That's fair enough. And then my second question is, it's an opinion question. Could it be that there has not been any request to this board, because I've been on for several years, and could it be due to the time it takes to publicize the meeting and the cost, which then, if an individual has a problem, that by the time it got to this board, it may cost them a lot more money than the decision being made?
I couldn't speculate, since I'm not on that side of the table. Maybe some of the people testifying tonight can speak to that.
Excellent. And then the last question is really this ISO rating. People in the industry have challenged that, clear up to the mayor, and that answer has never been answered about whether the ISO rating, if it dropped in points, and if one of the board members can help me, that'd be helpful. It's never been answered to any binding degree that if the ISO rating dropped, that the rates would increase in this town.
We have done quite a lot of research about that, because as you know, we did have a lengthy interview process this year. We actually were surprised when we received our evaluation that they found problems in our processes and have identified those problems. We're working, we're in the midst of a work plan with the ISO people to remedy those problems. We have to the end of this year to do that. If we do not make these changes, they have told us that our rates, our rating will go down. Now, in the course of working through that process, we have done research with the insurance companies around town, and we have learned that they do use it. One, for example, Allstate does use the ISO rating. It's factored in by their corporate headquarters, you know, they have a program that when the individual agent is inputting information and says where the particular property is, the program will automatically put down the ISO rating and use that to factor the rate. So it is used effectively.
Thank you. Any other questions of Ms. Walsh from the board? Mr. Steele?
I had a couple of questions, and some of them might be that I'm not able to go through all of the supporting ordinance statutes and the same. Presently, if there is an appeal and either side, the municipality or the appellant, doesn't like the decision of the board, it can be taken to the Superior Court for adjudication or another look at it. And since I've been on the board, we've had one instance where that's occurred. I'm not seeing in this ordinance if that structure is still in place or who becomes the board of adjudication for our decisions, or will there be one?
Perhaps Mr. Weaver can
I
answer
think it would
that.
always go to Superior Court, but probably after a deliberative process, if it wasn't from the three-member panel that would win up to the entire board, that would certainly be appealable to the courts.
Okay. But right now, we don't have, for example, it can't be appealed to the assembly or can't be appealed to another board. So the court was the avenue that one would take, and I'm assuming
Right. There
the
was
same would reside with this.
Mr. Steele, I believe, I was told by, I think Baker, I think all boards in Anchorage are set up with that caveat at the end that it's appealed to the Superior Court for the state of Alaska after the appeal is.
Actually, it's not true. A lot-
It's not true?
Depends on the type of decision, the type of board, the composition, whether it's quasi-judicial or legislative. Your decisions are appealable to Superior Court. The other boards and commissions, depending on how they're acting, the zoning board of examiners appeals decisions are appealed to Superior Court. The plating boards appeal to the Board of Adjustment. So there's many, many different avenues for appeal.
And then one other question, has there been any discussion or review as a board? Do we assume any personal liability if we are participating in a variance from code?
That's an interesting question. We may pursue that with the legal department, but traditionally, typically, if you're acting in your official capacity as a board member on a board, you have immunity from those kinds of issues.
Thank you.
Yes.
Question for Ms. Walsh. Could you clarify what the variance is kind of a strong word in this case versus modifications that the code allows? Could you clarify the difference between those two with respect to the bill?
Well, what I can, again, I did mention the language of, if we go to Title 23, Part 10, 10331, and it's the scope, powers and duties of the building official, and it's short, so I'll read it. Building officials authorized and directed to enforce the provisions of this code, render interpretations of the code, to adopt policies and procedures in order to clarify the application of its provisions. Such interpretations, policies, and procedures shall be in compliance with the intent and purpose of this code and shall not have the effect of waiving requirements specifically provided for in this code. Then when you go further into the powers and duties of the Building Board of Examiners and Appeals, it establishes that in order to hear and decide appeals, orders, decision determinations, shall be hereby created a Board of Appeals. It talks about the structure. The board shall adopt limitations of authority. The board shall have no authority to waive requirements of this code. So in present situation, I, the building official, or any of the regular deputies, cannot waive code, and the Board of Examiners Appeals cannot waive code. That's set in our statute. The modifications, interpretations, I'll give you an example. We had, just came up not too long ago, out at the airport, there's at the railroad terminal, there's an escalator. And the escalator, it's that part that they close off every so often for the, the railroad part. And they had a metal gate that, that swung closed. And as time went on, they decided, well, let's change that into a wall. And because of a miscommunication, that didn't get caught at the review stage, that part of that wall encroached upon the exiting of the escalator. You're supposed to have, I think it's 3 by 3 or something like that. And with the curtain wall, with the metal curtain, when it was open, there was no obstruction. When it was closed, no one was using it, so, no problem. Once they determined to put a glass curtain wall in there, they put it along the same alignment as the previous curtain. Well, it turned out that did encroach into that 3 by 3, and it said, inspectors called it, said it shall be 3 by 3. They brought it to me as a modification appeal. The amount that it was a 2-inch by 8-inch encroachment, and it came out to about 0.11 a square of a foot. And I determined that that was a sufficient modification, that we could grant that as a modification. That's the kind of thing we would do as a modification. Now, if it had been half of that area was compromised, we wouldn't have done it. We felt that that would have had the provision of ways in the code. Does that help?
Yeah, I guess kind of a follow-up, how would you feel about this proposal if instead of granting variances, it granted modifications?
Well, we feel that's already in place, because the modification clause is there. If someone feels that I have not correctly offered a modification, then they can bring that to the board now, and the board can offer modification, can interpret it as a modification. So we feel it's already in place for that, that avenue.
Thank you.
Yes.
Did you find anything in the ordinance that you liked, that you looked at as an advantage?
Through the chair, one thing that we did feel was helpful was the jurisdictional, bringing the definition of the jurisdictional, the types of things that you hear. That's really spelled out in the code of regulations, and that would be cleaner to have it up front in the code. We did have one, we feel there's a redundancy in that, however, it's, if you go to, and on your copies of the ordinance, it's 2310-10341, and it lists 5 items. Powers and duty: 1, to hear appeals from decisions of administrative officials and other enforcement orders; 2, to grant variances with strict application of the code; 3, to hear requests for interpretation of building code regulation. We feel that 3 is actually redundant, because we feel that the interpretation of regulation is done at the staff level, and then if there's a problem with that, they bring it in to you from the appeals. We don't feel that you guys wanted to be full-time interpreting code. That's staff's job first, and then we can, if there's still a question, then it should come to you. So we didn't really have a problem with bringing the definitions of the jurisdictional information forward.
Thank you.
Satisfy your question, Mr. Phil?
Yes.
Ms. Walsh, not to be argumentative here, but since you gave an example of a difference between a variance and a change of code, may I throw you out an example? Since I'm a builder and come down this department quite a bit, but if you have a kitchen and the first kitchen outlet has to be within 24 inches of the sink, and sometimes the buyers of a house want a larger window in front of the sink, which doesn't give you the ability to put the outlet there, and maybe the outlet has to be 3 feet from the sink. And I've tested this on several occasions, and you won't waive that, or at least your electrical division will not waive that. And would this board then, wouldn't it be better to bring something like that to the building board and have them, I mean, it's not hurting anybody, but yet they could waive that, and it's a variance from the code, that's really not a life safety issue.
Most of, through the chair, most of of those kinds of questions, most of the regulations have a reason behind them. Now, I'm not gonna pretend to be expert on every piece of every code, electrical, mechanical, plumbing. So we do rely on our electrical folks to do that research, go to the commentary, and delve into the reasons for that distance. And if that reason is borne out as having a valid basis, then we uphold it. So there may be a reason that may not be apparent. It may seem on the face of it to be perfectly logical to allow this to move. And then when you get into the details of it, you learn that there is a reason for that.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the board? Yes.
One question. What is the current public notice requirements for when somebody requests an appeal and when the board, how quickly, what is that time period that we have to
I don't know that there's a time. It says that we shall call when the appeal comes in, that we shall call a meeting. Hold on, I'll see. Real quick, I'll find that. And the procedure is in the AMCRs again.
I think it's 30 days, Ms. Walsh. I think for public notification and everything. I read something in our manual that it was a 30-day process.
Here, yes, building board shall hear and decide appeals from actions of administrative officials relating to code regulations. Person with the right to appeal has 30 days from the date of the action to file an appeal. And if no appeal is filed within this time, then the action is deemed final and binding and not subject to further appeal. Once they do make an appeal, that's in the regulations, I believe. And case file has to be established. I'm sorry, that's not jumping out at me.
Jerry, isn't
It could
it,
be anywhere from 14 to 30 days, but we'll have to figure out.
it's a minimum 10-day notice for a public hearing or something?
We'll have to see.
Again, we don't get very many appeals, so we're not.
Does that help you at all?
Yes, thank you.
2 weeks to 30 days, I guess. That's good. Answer of record. Is that good?
And the meeting that you, the meeting is 1 week, notification of a meeting, correct, Tana?
7 days.
So we have to advertise to the public that there's a meeting, we have a minimum 1 week time for that.
We could, 10 days notice, or actually a week's notice, if it's not a regular scheduled meeting. If it's a regular scheduled meeting, it's usually about 30 days.
Thank you. Any other questions? Hearing none, thank you, Ms. Walsh. Now we'll start our public testimony. You know what? Thanks to iPhone, I found a stopwatch. So we're all good.
So we've got 2 hours.
Mr. Trombley, please state your name for the record and spell it, please.
Adam Trombley, Trombley, Assemblyman, East Anchorage. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, appreciate your time. I'd like to go through my ordinance and just give you an understanding of what is it exactly that I have done and why I've done it. This is a direct result of talking to industry, of talking to the building industry, and the challenges that they have, and this would be a remedy to those issues. What I've done is I've expanded the board from anywhere from 11 to 15 members. What I've done from there is I've broken it down, and there can be up to 5 3-member panels, so that more than one appeal can be heard at a time. The other change that I've made is that chair or the secretary, depending on the appeal that comes before the body, has the ability to say, we have an appeal dealing with mechanical. Mr. Merchant, you deal with mechanical, we're gonna put you and members who understand mechanical on that 3-member panel to hear that issue. There's a structural, I don't know here, apologize, I don't know here it deals with structural issues, but we say here's a structural issue, we're gonna put members of the body who understand structural issues so that they can make a legitimate call on the appeal. The other thing that I've done, and what I've done is I've modeled this after what the building official's authority already has, is that Now, I use the term variance. The building official can already grant modifications. And from my understanding and talking to the city attorney, is that 90% of the time, if there is an issue with a building official and a builder, they can call up the building department and say, hey, I'm having this and this and this problem. Sharon Walsh or somebody else has the authority to say, nope, that's okay, we're gonna grant this modification. Now, in listening to her testimony, one of the things that she mentioned is that in order to grant modifications, there has to, dealing with the state, the official state building, and running that by them. I don't know if 90% of the time that's done or not. But the building, what I think is important is that giving this body, who knows your business, no one knows your business better than you do. You should have the ability to say, this is right and this is wrong. You can accomplish the same thing. We can grant this variance. It doesn't affect life, safety, or health. Because let's face it, raise your hand if you want to burn a building down, if you want your product to fail, if you want someone to die. You don't. That's bad for your business. You don't want to kill your customers. You know what's best for your business. And when you see something that says, okay, here's strict application of code, but I can meet the intent of that code by going about it a different way. It's less expensive for me. It's less expensive for the consumer. It becomes a business-friendly city. And so that's why I think giving you guys the ability and the authority to do that is good for business and it's good for the people of Anchorage. The other thing that I've done is I've changed the composition of the body. I put it in favor, I put more people who are actively engaged in their profession. I think that's important. People who have an appeal come before them, who have had real life experience in the situation that they're hearing. I think that's good. I think two people who deal with mechanical can talk and say, hey, yeah, I deal with that issue too. We can meet the intent of the code. Let's do that, as opposed to someone who isn't actively engaged. No offense, but maybe over a period of time, you lose your edge a little bit. I think it's important that people of industry can deal with people of industry. If for any reason the three-member body doesn't makes their case and says this is our ruling, the builder or if the city itself doesn't like the answer of the three-member panel, can always appeal to the 11 to 15 member body. What I've modeled that after is what the appellate courts do. Is they say they can hear nine judges on an appellate court. They can hear 3 cases at a time. You don't like the ruling, you can always appeal to the 9 judges. It works on the appellate courts. I think you guys are smart enough to make it work here as well. And then the final change I've made is two more changes. Is that I've put strict timelines as far as when information has to be sent out and when information has to be requested. Aside from the fact that you've already paid your permit, you're out there building, you have time constraints, whether it's weather or customers that delay projects, the last thing you need is the city to come along and delay your project longer. Time equals money. I do understand that for you guys. The strict timelines is able to provide you with the ability to say, look, I have an issue with, this is the 10% of the time when I can't deal, when we're at odds, the builder and the city are at odds. This is the 10% of the time which I need to take this to the board. Now, if it's a $500 deal, if it's saying, if you say, I can accomplish this, they say no, it costs $500 to change it, is that worth you guys going through this process? I don't know. But now you know how long it's going to take you. That's a business decision. That power is now in your hands. Is this a good business decision? If it's $20,000, is it worth it? I don't know. You know your business. So I think allowing you guys the ability to say, yes, this is a process which I'm worth doing, I'm fairly confident that if there's a $100 issue, you're probably not going to go through the process of a $100 filing fee, the 10 days in order to go through the process, to sit before the body, to appeal to the 9-member panel. So, and again, since the process has only been used one time since 2007, it's either gonna hit the planning department's bottom line or it won't. You can't say this is really gonna hurt us because we're making these changes. However, it hasn't been used since 2007. It either is gonna be used, it either is used or it isn't used. So, I do struggle with that, as far as where the planning, or where the department's coming from. It's either gonna hit your bottom line or it won't. You can't have it both ways. So, but again, it's a business decision on your hands. Are you gonna go through this process? And then the return of the filing fee, that is modeled after if you appeal your property taxes, it's the same thing, $100 filing fee, regardless of the outcome, you get your money back as long as you go through the process. It's been very, very, very successful there. It can be very successful here as well. There's no reason why it can't be. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Trombley. Any questions for Assemblyman Trombley from the board? Mr. Steele?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Trombley, I just had a couple of questions about the structure of the ordinance and underlying intent. Now, it has a range of 11 to 15 members, yet quorum is always based on 6. Is there, in your viewpoint, 6 out of 15 is?
Well, if that's a change that needs to be made, I'll absolutely make that change. So
Okay.
obviously, 6 out of 15 wouldn't work.
And then the other question I had is, what is your reasoning for the smaller group to be recused from participating in a board-wide discussion of the issue? Are they tainted, or does it lead to a perceived conflict of interest, having them heard it the first time, or at least the way I'm understanding it? They're not allowed.
I don't understand.
If a panel of 3 hears something and it's then brought forward to the board, whether it be from the administration or the board chooses to have it, if I'm reading this right, and I have 2 versions here, but it seems that the 3 panel members don't participate in the larger board action, and maybe.
Where are you reading that at?
Page 5, line 4, or that over here.
And members of that hearing panel shall not participate in the decision on whether the building board shall exercise its discretion to hear the appeal. So I was wondering why.
No, absolutely, that's a legitimate change. I appreciate you catching that. I clearly worded that wrong.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I struck out not, and it didn't make it in the final version.
Okay. And so with that understood, then the board would consist of the 11 or 15, and the
Yes, sir.
quorum would be based on the majority of that.
Correct.
And is it fair to ask, in terms of the industry that you discussed with, it was primarily contractors and?
Contractors, builders, developers.
So it covered the whole range of residential through commercial, large, small scale?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Steele, for clarification, on the quorum issue, you're just saying half plus 1 for a quorum. So if
Well-
it's 15, it'd be 8. If it's 11, 6 is still good. Is that what you're stating?
I think maybe the language needs to state what, that you're getting past 50% is.
Any other questions for Assemblyman Trombley? Seeing none, you may be called back. I appreciate your testimony. We're not in school, but can I just see a show of hands of who's in favor and who's opposed? No, just in favor first. Okay. Like I said, I'm gonna give you folks all like 4 minutes time. Could you try to keep your comments, not so much redundancy, try to bring up new facts, new statements if you could when you testify. When you come up, please state your name and spell it for the record. And we'll start with the gentleman in blue, Mr. Taylor.
I get to go first.
No, you pick someone else if you'd like. But
I'm good, you wanna go?
I'll go first if you want. I'm president of the Anchorage Home
Sure,
Builders, so.
that's a good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Cody Lee, C-O-D-Y-L-E-E. I'm the current president of the Anchorage Home Builders and also an owner of a construction company too. And so we've looked as the Anchorage Home Builders, we've looked this over and are in favor of this. We think there has been a demonstrated need for some kind of a process to appeal from the building department. We have 60 builder members, and we have a total of 250 members, and we continuously hear complaints of trying to deal with building safety down here, and when they finally dig in their heels and say that's the way it is, there's really not an avenue for us to go. And so we're looking for a way to appeal their decision, because sometimes their strict view of the code is not the way that we view it. There's a lot of interpretations of the code, and the way that building safety views it is not always the way that we view it, and we would like a way to appeal that process. So I think there is a demonstrated need for this. We've met with the mayor. We've brought countless letters from professionals, engineers, architects of issues with building safety, and we haven't been able to get past that. So we really think this would work out for us. So the next thing is just the real strict interpretation of the code that comes and goes with the administration of building safety. And this has been an ongoing problem for a lot longer than I've been around, and we'd like to have some way to have a way to count on what's going on down at building safety, rather than just who is in the leadership of building safety. The next thing is, everybody talks about this ISO code and how we'll lessen this ISO code if they have any kind of appeal process for building safeties, any kind of interpretation of the code rather than just a strict interpretation. My question would be, they talk about this ISO code. Girdwood has no plans review, has no inspection. Eagle River has no plans review, no inspection, which is all part of Anchorage. So how does that play into this ISO code? You know, if they've got to interpret the code so strictly here, right in the bowl, and they don't out in Eagle River or Girdwood, how does this play into the ISO code? It doesn't make any sense to me. And nobody's been able to explain about this insurance rating and all of this, how this works, and we have no inspections out there. We don't have a rash of failures. We don't have any of these things going on. The builders are policing themselves there, obviously, and we don't have a big issue. So, I mean, that's pretty hard to understand. The next thing is we're not looking to waive the code as it was put on, that we're just gonna waive the code. We just want somebody to appeal for another interpretation of the code to see if building safety is interpreting it correctly, and that's what we're looking for. So, and building safety talks about the cost of this appeal and their cost to them. It's a huge cost to us builders to come in here and spend a lot of time at building safety, appealing it, or just trying to work our issues out. It's a huge cost to us, and building safety never seems to take that into account, that our time is valuable, and we are not getting paid when we're standing here at the counter.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. I'm going to have to stop you there. Any questions of Mr. Lee from this panel? Mr. Boney?
What's in this ordinance that makes it easier to appeal your concerns versus taking it to the full board now?
The things that I understand that makes it easier, one is it's a $100 fee versus $500, and they have tried to expedite this to where we can get an appeal through quicker. Also, it gives the board the ability to not interpret the code directly to the letter of the code, but to the intent of the code. And that's what we would like to, we always want to comply with the intent of the code. And as
to us, that seems to be the most important thing, that we want to have life safety and comply with the intent of the code. And sometimes applying with the letter of the code can be very costly or impossible. I'm a remodeler, in some places, it is impossible to go to the letter of the code.
Yes, Mr. Friedman.
Yeah, I guess I would have that same kind of question. I've been on the board for 5 years. I've seen 2 appeals. If the building industry is having an issue getting access to the board, are you being told you can't make an appeal to the building board? Or, I mean, that's kind of the big question, is we're 10 days away, so what's holding you back from getting to us?
We're not told that we can't appeal to the building board, but we've been told that you have to have a strict interpretation of the code, and you don't have the ability to interpret the intent of the code versus the letter of the code.
So they're telling you can't?
Not saying we can't. Just saying the way that you have to interpret the code is to the letter and not to the intent.
And, if I may?
Yes.
Second question is, these items that you are requesting from modification or variance/variance, whatever the definition may be, obviously you're spending a lot of time at the counter. All of us have spent a lot of times working with the building board on our particular project as well. We fully understand that process. What are the financial cost impacts associated with a lot of these items? Is it more than $500 of the cost impact of yes or no, based on what the building board would say?
I would think the cost would have to be more than a $500 cost to you to make it worth coming to the building board. It would have to be something pretty substantial, because as a project, you've got to move forward, and if you bring it to a stop, it's got to be a real reason. And this just gives us the ability, if we get to a point that we really need to, that we could come to the building board with some hope that we would come with a different outcome than we have at the building safety, the reason we was turned down or rejected, whatever.
Mr. Steele?
Yes, Mr. Lee, based on some of the preceding questions, what do you envision the timeline into this new process of when you decide to appeal to the panel and when it would be resolved? Do you have in mind a timeline of the duration?
I don't at this point. That's why I say I do believe it would have to be something pretty substantial before it was appealed to the board to try to resolve it. And it would have to have a pretty substantial cost attached to it to make it worth our while.
And I'm talking about the new process. It would still have to be a substantial issue for you.
Absolutely.
Because you view things of lower cost value, it's easier to move forward.
Absolutely. We do that day in and day out. It's like if an inspector writes you up on a job, you may not agree with his interpretation, but if it's a $200 deal, you just say, we'll take care of it. You know, if it's a $2,000 deal, then you start thinking about it. And you start thinking about coming down to building safety and talking with building safety, see if you can work it out.
So, and again, this is, I'm sorry if I'm not fully comprehending it, but if it then becomes a significant monetary value, what is the benefit of this format versus coming to us?
As the board currently is,
With the structure right now of, we were on a monthly schedule, we haven't met because there's not been the need. When I first was on the board, there were periods where there were more appeals, and I remember prior to that it used to be a fairly busy board in terms of the numbers of meetings. And I think a lot of that spoke to issues being resolved or not being resolved. But in support of this, it seems that you're first making a decision based on the significance of cost and impact. And then you're choosing to go to support this, and I'm trying to understand what the salient advantage to you is of this format and this ordinance over the current. Is it the viewpoint of a strict interpretation?
Yes, it's from the viewpoint of a strict interpretation of the code that we would not agree that code required that strict interpretation, that there's another way to accomplish the same intent. And building safety may not agree with that. And this gives us an alternative to go to and to ask you guys to take a look at it.
And finally, have you utilized or pursued the alternative means and methods successfully in the past to deal with some of these issues?
I have, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Who's next? Pick one. State your name, please, and spell it.
Bill Taylor, Billtaylor. I've been a residential builder in Anchorage for over 30 years. And the way I see this coming together is that this ordinance gives you an opportunity through the language in second page under B, 1 and 2, to give the industry a chance, because it's a real response. Like Mr. Conley said, it's an industry outcry, if you want to call it that, for help. And so this gives the board an opportunity to look at this, what I call an obsession by the city on over-interpreting the code. The board needs some kind of language to hang their hat on when we come to you for an appeal. And we're not asking to delete a handrail from a 30-story overlook so that you run the risk of any kind of life safety. This really boils down to the technical issues that we have in trying to get past, again, the plan reviewers, total immersion in the code. We need some common sense to apply. And the language in B1 and 2 gives the board that chance, whether it's a full board of 11 members or a panel of 3. I don't think that really matters. What's important is that you can see and use your own experience and your own application and understanding of the code and say, well, this makes sense or it doesn't make sense. There's just an enormous amount of hair splitting that goes on in the plan review department that drives the industry crazy. And I think there's just a philosophical difference between what the city interprets the code, or how they interpret the code, and how the builders or whomever interprets the code. There's the big difference, and this kind of sums it up, is we see substantial compliance with the code as effective. They see, and this is kind of over dramatization, but they're looking for 110% compliance with the code. And there's the rub. I mean, the long and short of it is we can't get past that. So when we apply for alternate means and methods, it's typically a stonewall, because you're not going to get past the city with alternate means and methods. But what this does is provide a gateway for the board, or whether it's a board or a panel, to look at our interpretation of the code, and again apply some common sense to come up with a reasonable solution. I think the builders in this town are very reasonable. If we bring something before you, it's not some bizarre pie in the sky kind of alternate means and methods. It's just something reasonable that picks up the slack and gives us a chance to, what I call, do some simple value engineering, because the pendulum has really swung much too far. And again, the ordinance is a response to that pendulum swinging so far to the right that we're choking over it. So
I gotta cut
think
you off,
that
Mr. Taylor.
pretty much sums it up.
Thank you. Any questions of Mr. Taylor? Mr. Boney?
You just mentioned here that, in your opinion, the pendulum has swung quite far to the right. Is this something that's occurred over the last 6 months, the year, 5 years? How, give me an idea of time frame.
Well, my recollection of it, it started with Andy Stember and James Gray. Andy was the lead plan reviewer at the city, probably 15-plus years ago. And, they, being Andy and James Gray, decided that, we weren't in compliance with the code, the window size and sections of the code. So it's been, since that point in time to the present, where it's gotten stricter and stricter and stricter and stricter, and in my opinion, to the point where it's just counterproductive. It's not cost effective for the builder, and the builder either has to take and absorb the cost or pass the cost on to the customer. So what we're looking for is something a little more balanced, and we're not getting it now, frankly, and that's what we're looking for. That again, I call it an obsession with the code. It's like you can't look beyond the code book to see what can be practical in the construction that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And again, value engineering is really important to us now, and we can't do it. The city won't allow us to take that step forward. The ordinance gives us the opportunity to.
Does that satisfy your question, Mr. Boney?
Yes.
Mr. Steele?
Mr. Taylor, you just made mention about value engineering. Is that linked to the hardship issue in the proposed ordinance?
No, I think the hardship portion of that, and I'm not sure, that's my interpretation. Somebody else might want to comment on that. The hardship portion of it seemed to me, if you're mom and pop homeowner that has a negative write-up on a code compliant issue, that they just, it's just, a $20,000 or $50,000 fix. That's how I view that.
And I guess, and then a follow-up, in terms of a lot of the strictness that you view, you're viewing it as having cost impact. But I assume the more you build and the more you work with the city, the more you understand what can be expected with interpretation. Do you find yourself rolling that into your product as the next one you do, and successfully doing that?
Well, I don't know if it's successful is the right term, but what we do is anticipate what the city is going to require. And then we build that into our engineering, whether it's, drag struts or shear walls or hold downs or whatever. But it never seems to stop. You certainly have new provisions in the code that have to be incorporated when there's a code change, but there's all this overinterpretation of the code, the provisions in the wind and seismic section of IBC that killed the residential builder. It killed not in a literal sense, but it's extremely difficult, and it's not cost effective, and it doesn't add any value, because our houses, I feel right now, are, since we've raised that level from the Andy Stember and James Gray day to the level that we have now, there's no risk in that house, any life safety risk whatsoever. What it appears now is it's all about preventing any kind of property damage, sheetrock cracks. And, those are easy to fix. So we're spending all this time and energy and engineering and money trying to prevent sheetrock cracks. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't compute in my mind.
And then one last question. You indicated you've been practicing for quite a few years here in Alaska, and you must enjoy it, but have you had experience with other jurisdictions in terms of their plan review process, or talked to others about if it's a similar feeling of overkill? I mean,
Well, yes, I'm one of the people that brought the white paper forward from the Washington State Building Officials Association and their Structural Engineering Association. And this white paper talks about this friction that exists between the industry and plan review. And the industry feels that it's too strict, and plan reviewers are, you know, on the opposite side of the fence, and they're just following the code. So what the white paper did was try to reconcile this difference between industry and plan review. And what the key word that was involved in this is you can be substantially compliant with the code and still have a building that will perform. And I think what we're trying to do as an industry is introduce that concept. And we're giving you language as board members so that you can open that door. And when we do have technical issues, we can come to you inexpensively. And again, whether it's 3-member or 6-member, you can hear our case and make a quick decision. But without the language, you're still kind of stuck in no man's land. You don't have the word, you know, modification or variance or substantially compliant. It just doesn't exist. But if you had that language, like we've got in the ordinance, then you have an opportunity to hear our case and make a decision. And again, applying more common sense to the decision than anything.
that just led me to one quick follow-up. So why do you think the codes are written the way they are?
Well,
Why don't they embrace those terms that the white paper does?
Well, it's difficult to, well, you kind of have a right and left brain that work there. Because as a plan reviewer, you have to have everything very literal. And when you're a builder, things aren't as literal. You know, you can draw it up and make it code compliant on paper, but in the field, you have to make it work. So I think the code, in its best effort, tries to do that through the alternate means and methods. And however, it falls short, because as a code document, you can't talk about substantially compliant. I understand that. But if you understand the need for substantial compliance, rather than with, you know, strict, hair-splitting adherence to the code, then you understand the term substantial compliant.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have one, I have two, actually.
You had one more down here.
I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand there.
Sorry, I
I
was a
thought
bit
you were
late.
just holding your chin up. Apologize. Go ahead,
Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Straight.
As been discussed, there's stuff in the current layout of the municipal code that allows you to request a modification of the building official, and if that is denied, you can appeal that to this board. How is that different than the process that, or how is that, what is wrong with that process that is not currently used? If you want a modification, they say, you know, and then you can bring it to us to ask for the same modification. Why is that not done?
Well, our experience is, it's no. And, you know, we expect that from the city. You know, 99 out of 100 times, they're gonna say no. So what you look for is another pathway. And the ordinance provides that pathway. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Again, it's a cry for help from the industry by saying, we need an alternate route to look at another set of eyes with a different set of experience. I mean, really, in all due respect to the plan review department, you know, that's their business, is the code. So you need to be able to kind of step out of that sometimes and look at code compliance with a different set of eyes, with a different attitude, with a different level of experience. And so, yet it's there, Mr. Straight, but it's, from our perspective, it's a dead end.
So you're looking for a way to essentially short circuit that, being able to come directly to us for ask for this variance and or modification?
Oh, no, I don't interpret it that way. I mean, the procedure is you go to the city and ask for an alternate means and methods. If you're denied, then you come to the building board. I don't see that procedure being a shortcut to that procedure. I mean, personally, I don't see that. But what I do see is we go to the city with the expectation of a no. And then we're looking to the ordinance as a complement to the alternate means and methods portion of the code.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mr. Straight, that get you your answer?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Taylor, it was mentioned here on the board, I just want clarification about, can you learn what the plan review wants or expects from you? I've heard tale in the industry that a lot of the situations that arise actually happen in the field due to possible customer changes or alterations in a lot. Can you reflect on that, please?
Well, a lot of times you get something unexpected, so you need to regroup on the fly. I think Cody might have mentioned that. So you need some kind of mechanism in place that you can get a quick decision. And so, I mean, I can even imagine certain circumstances where you follow the normal procedure and then concurrently you apply to the building board for a modification. So, you know, if you're trying to really fast track a decision, that would be my alternate. So typically, you know, it's, in terms of value engineering as an example, it's not something that you're in the field and it's like, oh no, you know, I need a quick decision. You're just trying to come up with some kind of effort to bring some cost effectiveness back into the formula when you're constructing a house. When you run into a situation in the field where it's an uh-oh, then you need a fast track opportunity. So maybe you concurrently apply to the board and the city at the same time.
Thank you. I have one left. This is going to be, I think, a tough one. Mr. Lee answered it to Mr. Steele's question, but knowing how the building board is handled now and knowing how it's what's comprised of, and can you see your company utilizing this board how many times in a building season?
Oh, maybe a couple of times. I mean, I just don't see this, and I think, again, with all due respect to Mrs. Walsh, I don't see this as like this flood of appeals that are gonna come rushing through. I mean, the code is the code, and you can't escape that. And the code has intent. You can't escape that. So what we run into are just situations where, again, we're trying to reconcile some differences, some technical differences. And I see that as really the issue. It's not whether you're gonna waive a handrail requirement on a 30-foot overlook. It's like whether you're gonna understand the difference between full-scale testing of houses or whole house testing of houses versus a line in a code book that says, that prohibits the use of certain items. So to me, and I'm trying to look ahead in my crystal ball, but to me, it looks like we're gonna use most of this for highly technical issues that pop up that can't be resolved easily with the plan review department.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, appreciate your testimony. Who's next? State your name, please. Spell your last name.
Doolin, D-E-V-I-D, D-O-O-L-E-N. If I'll keep mine pretty brief, because I think other people covered it pretty well, but just a general statement that nobody here is against codes, but at the same time, I'm sure that everybody here has run into situations where something doesn't make sense or could be done differently and would actually be better, but it's a literal violation of a code. I've run into that in stair situations and whatnot. We're not interested in compromising the code, the intent of the codes, or building safety in any way whatsoever. I think the arguments here are essentially flexibility versus rigidity. As everybody has said so far, that we come up with the expectation that we're going to fail. I have to point to the fact that you haven't been in appeal since 2007, you said. That says something right there, because it's not because there aren't a lot of people out there with issues that they would like to air. They're not airing it because of two reasons. Number one, because they're almost guaranteed failure under the way everything is being said right now, and it's $500. You know, it's like this system is designed, in my thinking, is designed specifically to just basically eliminate any kind of appeal process to do something a little bit differently. Obviously, if there's enough money involved, then people will already go through that. Now, I haven't gone before the board before. I have not done an alternate means of method, although I've considered it seriously, because I build with SIPs. And what I have run into with the municipality is, number one, they don't understand it, and number two, it really isn't covered very well in the code in terms of, the hold bounds are entirely different. There's a lot of things that are different, and your plan reviewers don't understand it, and they don't know how to deal with it. And when I suggested that when I first got blindsided with this a couple of years back, I said, well, okay, if I get these drawings completely engineered, structurally engineered, you have to accept them, right? And the response I got was a definite no. And no, we don't. And I said, because with the full engineering and everything else showing that we're accomplishing this and that. Anyway, it makes it, the rigidity that's in this thing now makes it really easy for these people to do their job. You know, it's pretty much no. Because they're interpreting everything to that level of rigidity that the code states. Now, can it be accomplished sometimes by tweaking the code a little bit, or doing something a little bit different that's not to the letter of the code, but meets the spirit of the code? And I think what this thing does is it gives us hope that we might actually have some success. And right now, as everybody has said, there's no hope. You know, we don't feel like there's any hope. And so that's why you're not seeing people coming in and taking advantage of this the way it is right now.
Thank you, Mr. Doolin. Is there any questions? Mr. Steele?
Yes, Mr. Doolin, I guess I would ask maybe a similar question I asked before. What would your expectation be for a timeline that you would entertain for a panel or fuller board to render a decision?
Something relatively expeditious, like 30 days, you know, I mean, kind of from the start of the process. Back when I ran into this issue with the SIPs, but I didn't know anything about it. It was one of the other members that said, have you checked into the alternate means and method and that? So I did go and I looked at that and I thought, well, number one, it was $500. Number two, it was the time. I didn't have the time. And so I just didn't do it. I was intimidated by it, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it kind of depends on the issue. And I don't know if there could be some flexibility in the timeline that these things happen either. Obviously, a bigger issue requires more thought, you know, that there's more to put together. On a relatively small issue, and the fact is, no really small issues are gonna come through this process, because just as it was stated before, you know, when you run into these things, you just kind of go and move forward, and you just comply. It's cheaper, unless you're talking thousands of dollars, it's cheaper to just comply most of the time.
Now, one question, you build with or do you manufacture SIPs?
I build with.
So have you found the industry supporting you in terms of engineering analysis, code analysis to address?
Well, that's a loaded question. The industry is trying. The other thing about the code, I think you asked a question a little bit ago, why is the code sort of the way it is? And for the most part, the code it's sticking to what is necessary in order to provide safe buildings. However, there's politics involved in this whole thing too, and sometimes it's politics is just another way of saying money. And with the SIPs industry, they've been fighting an uphill battle with Boise Cascade, Weyerhaeuser, the insulation, the glass insulation industry. I mean, there's all these people that have a real interest in not seeing these things get told. It's a losing battle in this case, but eventually they'll lose. But in the meantime, they're making huge profits doing, status quo. And, the industry, I mean, we've got our ICC, reports that we have to do and everything, but the testing procedures are bizarre. Like SIPs is an assembly. It's
Right.
if you take a 4-foot SIP and nail it down prescriptively and whatever, and then you try and put stresses to it, it's going to break loose. Of course it is. But that's the testing procedures that they say. They can't say throw a hold down here and put 3 of these things in a row, and see. And it's phenomenal the forces that it'll resist once you test it in the proper way. But the ICC comes up with test protocol, and that's really, really politicized. Did I answer your question?
I think so. Thank you. Any other questions, Ms. Doolin? Seeing none, thank you.
Chuck Holman, Holman Incorporated. Chuck, H-O-M-A-N, last name. Chairman, board members. I've been building in Anchorage since 1978, and attended the building board meeting at times. And years ago, Nelson Franklin sat on this board. I was just in the audience, and they turned down an appeal, and I asked him later about why. And he said that they needed to cite a specific code section in order to support the appeal. I mean, it just seemed like logical that this thing would get passed, but they denied it because there wasn't code language to support it. And I think the code is a continually changing document, and this board reviews it and submits it to the assembly. But the way it is right now, this board can't correct a mistake that it makes. And you gotta wait 3 years to make a change to that code again. And this board should have the same authority that the Title 21, you can appeal your zoning regulations and stuff, and that board can make changes. And this board should have the same authority as the other boards have. And That's the main thing there. And I think the department would support this, that if there is a mistake on the code, or another better way to do it, or enforce the code, that they would support that this body would issue a variance for all builders, or if there is an issue, even though the city has adopted the code in certain language that may be wrong. So I don't see why they wouldn't support some modification to the existing system. And then a correction, the state of Alaska has no jurisdiction over single-family homes. There is no state fire marshal jurisdiction on single-family, no building, plumbing, electrical, mechanical regulation on single-family homes, and most of these people are building single-family. Multifamily is a different story, but as far as single-family, that needs to be corrected in staff's documents there. But I don't want to repeat what's already been said. So.
Thank you, Mr. Holman. Any questions of Mr. Holman? Mr. Steele?
Mr. Holman, you cited that the representation tonight is primarily residential. It seems that that's the trend and people speaking in favor of this. Do you feel this ordinance is applicable to the commercial side as well as residential side, or all of the codes, or do you feel versed enough in all of the codes to address that?
I think it's applicable to everything. I think the reason you see it residential, as a residential builder, cost is very important to your consumer. When you go out there as a commercial contractor, general contractor, and you're bidding a job against 3 different contractors, you have an architectural set of plans, and everybody's basically bidding apples for apples. But when you're trying to build a single-family house, or I do mostly remodel, you know, they're looking at the dollar and the bottom line, and the most value for the money. And so cost in building single-family residential, I think, is a bigger factor versus being a general contractor where you're bidding a commercial project, whether it's a large tenant improvement or a new commercial building. So I think that's one reason we see fewer commercial builders issue.
And then with that said, you know, I'm more familiar with commercial work, but do you hire architects that vet out code issues and try to resolve these, or?
Yes, I mean, some of the remodels I've done has been with an architect and an engineer, and that was a very difficult process with the building department. My instructional inspector came on the job, looked at the plans, and said, no, check, you build it exactly how the plans are laid out, don't make any changes. And he inspected right to the plans. We did make some changes, and we tried the field change order, that was denied. It had, you know, I couldn't fill that out, had to come from the architect, and then, or the engineer. And, you know, so I've worked through those processes. But it's, but that's where it's a very rigid view of the code, even though what we were doing was okay. It was, you know, by the book and a little more forward.
And then one last, do you feel similar in terms of a 30-day time frame to be able to have something heard reasonable?
Well, that's probably about the maximum. I mean, that's what people said, is that time is money, and if you're in the middle of a project, you can't stop for 30 days. You gotta keep the project going and find a way of accomplishing what you need to. But I think on the plan review process, that would be something, you know, that, you know, appeal it while you continue to get plans going through the process or something like that. But, you know, yeah, I think that's about the longest length of time it'd be for you.
Well, I guess the reason I'm continually asking this is we all are professionals who are in the industry, and we hold day jobs other than where we are tonight. And I'm wondering if the expectation is that if you would like this appealed, is that 10 minutes later, there's a conference room full of the building board. I mean, do you see that as a practical response, or what do you think the frequency would have to be for meetings to support your needs?
I understand what you're saying. I think that's, the 3-member appeal board would make it a little easier to assemble a small group versus the entire body. on an appeal. I mean, I kind of like that provision that you're.
Well, and I don't want to be discussing this, but I just want to get a better sense, whether it be 3 members or 11 members, you still have quorums associated with them. You still have people fitting in, and the normal way of that occurring is to have regular set meeting times.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm trying to reach that point of, are we talking 30 days? Are we talking every week? Are we talking bi-weekly? You know, I mean, that's the thing I'm.
Well, I don't think, obviously the staff said they need time to prepare for it. But I would say, ideally, a couple of weeks would be, from a contractor standpoint. I mean, trying to stretch it out 30 days really puts a kink in your project one way or another.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Straight?
Sir, do you envision this appeal process occurring more during the plan review stage, or, something happened during construction type of stage?
I guess, like I've been mentioned before, the dollar volume involved with whatever the issue is, and hopefully, most things are resolved at the plan review stage and not when you're in the middle of construction on the job. That may happen. I mean, this project I had the architect on, I was written up for not having grade stamped lumber, and we used milled post from Superior Millwork, and there needed to be certified by a certified lumber grade. Well, there isn't a certified lumber grade in the state of Alaska, and the engineer wrote a letter that said that he inspected the 12-inch diameter timbers, that they were adequate to carry the load, and the plan reviewer's comment was he's not qualified to do that. And appealed it to the building official. He approved it, so it didn't come before you. But technically, you don't have the authority to approve it because it's not graded by a certified lumber grader, and that's in the code. And so the building official did approve it, but the way the code's written right now, you as a board could not approve using the spruce turned 12-inch diameter timbers. And I think you should have the authority to approve something like that.
Thank you.
Mr. Holman, you mentioned that the state of Alaska has, the state fire marshal has no authority over single-family buildings. Isn't it 1 and 2 family?
I believe it is. I just can't remember if it was 1 and 2 family, but yeah, it is in state statute that, 1 and 2 family dwellings are exempt from all states, from all building codes in the state.
And in your opinion, the reason most of the people present tonight are single-family and duplex builders, is it not your opinion that in the commercial industry that most of the costs and stuff just get passed on to the customer versus to the buyer, versus in a single family it does not, the builder has to absorb it?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how your contract, but yeah, I mean, like Bill said, you try and anticipate all the structural requirements going into a project, but until your plan review is completed, you've got to give your consumer, your buyer, a price to build that house so they can go get the financing, and you can get the financing, and you've got to do all that before you can actually, get your building permit. If you waited for your permit, then get your financing, just too long a time frame. So you're anticipating what they're going to require, but so, sometimes you take the loss on it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Does anyone else want?
Andre Spinelli, ANDRE, SPINELLI, residential builder. I'm also past president of the Anchorage Home Builders Association. I guess I like the idea of the ordinance. Speaking from the past president of the Home Builders Association point of view, I guess the $100 fee would maybe help give access to a lot of smaller members. Speaking personally, as a bigger builder, I build a lot of houses. I don't have a problem paying $500 for staff time. I've paid for variances in other formats, and it's actually a lot more expensive to get this many people from the muni in a room for an hour. It's pretty pricey, so I don't have a problem paying for it, but I like the access it gives to maybe the smaller builders. I also like the ability for the board to look at something and say, yeah, the code definitely says this, but we all know that maybe that's not right, and we think it'll be better if we, allow this. And I like the ability for that. I've several instances where the code just didn't quite spell it out. I don't want to go into too many examples because I can go on for days, just like everybody else. But I mean, I've had several instances where the code didn't really spell it out. And I guess I should also back up and say I have applied for, I have submitted applications to the building board. Two of them, one with the current building official and one with the previous, and neither of them made it past the building official's desk. They kind of got resolved at that point. But there are, one of the instances, the IRC just didn't really talk about landings that clearly, and I was granted an alternate means and methods after applying to the building board. Later, we looked in the IBC, and it actually spelled out landings a little clearer, and it was allowed in the IBC. So that was kind of in hindsight after I'd already had approval. But that's a perfect example of where the code might say no, and everyone agrees no, and even the building official might give you permission. It's it's just something that a board could actually look at it and say, yeah, that's fine. That's going to be fine. There's several other instances, but I think that's really all I had to say. I guess I like the idea of just opening up the process, maybe making it speedier, making it more available, maybe taking the pressure, taking some of the weight off of staff to make these decisions. Because I mean, I've dealt with staff and I've heard the quote, "Why do we have a code if we're not going to enforce it?" And on the same other side, I've had an engineer say, "I'm downgrading my design to meet the code." So it kind of goes, it goes both ways, I guess.
Thank you, Mr. Spinell. Any questions of Mr. Spinell? Yes, Mr. Merchant.
What is your opinion in regards to what the perfect board, in regard to, say, we got going off a structural issue, and who do you think needs to be on that board, that three-person board?
3 structural engineers.
Now that's a good point, because that's what
Yeah.
Is it set up as only structural people, or only
Maybe,
engineers?
for a structural question, I would imagine it would be at least two an engineer and maybe a contractor, if the contractor had experience in framing or steel fabrication or whatever it may be. So.
Any other questions? Mr. Spinell, I'd like to pump you up a little bit. I think you're one of the largest builders in the state, if not Anchorage solely. You've been in the business yourself 15, 20 years, maybe 15 years?
34 years
I'll
old.
give you that. 10 years. But have you seen the code? Because I've heard, I think a lot of people are under the impression that the code, which it is to protect the life safety of the occupants. But in the last 2, maybe 3 code cycles, have you seen the code go from that to more of a preservation of the structure versus the life safety of the occupants?
You would probably be getting into the point of my career where I was just a framer and a guy in the field too. I've only really been, engineering and permitting houses for maybe the last 3 code cycles. So, maybe my sight isn't as,
Okay,
doesn't
appreciate
go back
it.
as far.
Good enough. Thank you.
Members of the board, my name's Trevor Edmondson. It's TREVOREDMONDSON. I work for the Peterson Group, project development manager. Honestly, I just saw this ordinance about 5 minutes before this meeting, so I'm not sure how intelligently I can testify to the details of the ordinance, but what I can say is that we support Assemblyman Trombley's and the industry's efforts here to improve the mechanism by which the industry has to resolve issues. I think a lot of issues are resolved as they should be outside of this board, but an improved process is always a good thing. So it seems that this ordinance gives the board some latitude to weigh in and help resolve issues. It also seems to help expedite the process, and lower fees are always good, but I agree with Andre that fees ought to cover the costs to set these things up and to pay for them. So we're a big builder as well. $500 to us is not would not stop us from coming forward, but it might stop some of the smaller builders in the industry to carry this forward. So we just ask that you strongly consider what you've heard tonight, and consider the proposal for the benefit of the industry and the community.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, appreciate your testimony. Is that it? In favor? Anybody else want to testify? No? Those opposed, it's your opportunity. Seeing none, testimony is closed. I'm looking for a motion from someone on the board. Not an action to be taken. Mr. Steele, you willing to give it a shot?
My motion would be that the building board supports the language proposed in AO number 2012-19 and provide written affirmation for the upcoming public hearings with the Assembly.
Repeat that last part.
And provide written affirmation for the upcoming public hearing with the Assembly.
So if I may seek a second, please.
I'll second.
Well, motion's been made and seconded, and the motion made by Mr. Steele that the building board supports the language AO-2019, provide written affirmation at the upcoming public hearings held by the Assembly. And the motion was seconded by Mr. Boney. Mr. Steele.
Mr. Chairman, if I could speak to my motion. My initial feeling, and I'll wait to hear more discussion on it, is that I won't be supporting my motion. And it's not that I haven't listened to a lot of voices that have identified a concern, and I don't want to fly in the face of changing current ordinance and language that improves the situation. I'm not quite sure if this improves the situation. As a practicing architect, I've been in the state since 1979, and I probably, if I was to look at my history, is I've learned a lot from mistakes I made in terms of my interpretation of the code. But at the same time, I benefited from the interaction with the code people in terms of explaining the reasoning, working out some alternates that might be applicable, and resolve the issue. And to be honest, I don't think I've met a situation where I haven't had the ability to work it out with staff. And so I then step back from it and say, well, what is trying to be solved with this? And it's ultimately a path to a board that has a perspective and a reasonableness, but I think it all starts with, and I don't know how to say it other than relationships that might exist now between the building department and builders. And it's unfortunate to hear that perception is the answer is no before I even go there. I'm not hearing that anyone is adverse, with the exception of someone hoping for 2 weeks, that a month cycle is maybe not appropriate for it to be heard. And I know in sitting on cases where we have deliberated issues, we do base our decisions on the points of code. But I think there's been some, what I would call not flexibility, but some latitude in interpretation that have made situations more palatable. And they've been based on findings of fact and discussions and deliberation of the board. And I'm just not quite certain that this vehicle is resolving that much more. Because I almost sense that everyone expects these issues to be significant dollar value, otherwise they wouldn't come forward, and to be resolved right away. And I don't know if this is the way. I would almost suggest that there maybe be some workshops with the city and the building community to work through this more. More participation. I know some of the faces participate in the code cycles, but more participation where these issues, these specifics can be deliberated amongst not only the design, the construction, the manufacturing community, but with the building department, and try to get a better sense of what these issues are. So at this point in time, I'm not quite sure that I'm seeing this as the way to resolve this. And so with that said, waiting to hear more, but I don't think I'll be supporting my motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Mr. Volney?
I also will not be supporting the motion, and I second it. I'm not convinced that we have a broken system. We do have an appeal process, as I understand it from what Mr. Weaver mentioned on a special meeting. There's like a 10-day notification, which is not unreasonable from what I hear from testimony. I do not agree that the board can only meet the literal interpretation of the building code, that we do have the authority to meet the intent, as does the building official through the alternate means and methods. I don't see what is going to be accomplished by the ordinance. And frankly, I'm a little concerned about some of the detrimental items that were brought to our attention by the building official regarding deviations away from the building code.
Any other comments? Mr. Feller?
I too will not be supporting the motion because I feel that all the issues that I've heard raised in the public testimony can be addressed under the system that we have in place. With the alternate methods, alternate materials and methods and means section and modification sections of the code, I don't think that this board is going to be rigid about some of the code issues that industry has come to loggerheads with the building department over. I think we can meet in a timely manner to address appeals that the industry brings forward. I haven't heard, I mean, the $500 fee may be a bit of an obstacle, but I don't think that's the reason that the process hasn't been used. So I mean, I think we have everything in place with the system we've got to address the concerns I've heard here tonight. It's just not being utilized. And I also think that the building official does have some very valid points in the you know, eight issues that were raised as being potential problems with the ordinance. That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Merchant?
I guess I look at this on, I look at this on the mechanical side of what I have to deal with on a daily basis, and not necessarily the builder side, and which is a little more challenging for me on that portion. Because on the mechanical side, I don't have an issue because I'm able to deal with the mechanical, the mechanical, and nothing is black and white in mechanical. There's always a gray. If the contractors, if there's not a gray and it's only black and white, I can see where that's a major problem. And it is I think ultimately there has to be a gray, because sitting on the code board, I look at all these codes, and all these codes that are passed that, I fight against, or they fight against me, or whatever the case may be. And now I know why some of these codes are on this board, or in the book, is because they get, we have a board of 12 and 15 people there that are trying to pass these, and some of them don't make any sense at all. And so I guess where I'm going with it is, I think there does need to be a grade on the mechanical, or on the building side. If there isn't that grade, if somebody can't make that, if it's only gonna be black and white, I can see where the major problem is. I'm not 100% sold on the 3-person board, but I guess that would have to be explained a little bit more, but it is, but I guess I'm for it in regards to what I've heard tonight on versus the builders versus the municipality.
Any other comments? Yes, Mr. Fadine?
I'm also not in favor of the proposed motion. And like Mr. Merchant, I'm also a mechanical engineer. And my workings with the staff have been always very educational, and I've been able to work with them very simply and professionally and logically. And so it sounds like this is coming from one sector of the building industry, and I'm very sympathetic to the issues that you guys are having. But the current proposed ordinance change is very dangerous. It opens up a lot of doors that could be taken advantage of by people who are purely profit motivated. And it's unfortunate, but it just has too great of a risk. There are other avenues that I would highly recommend that the home builders pursue. For instance, the electrical engineers have, is it monthly meetings with the electrical inspectors? There's like a lunch thing that the inspectors are there, the electrical engineers are there, contractors are there, and they just talk about code. They talk about how things are being interpreted in the field.
Bi-monthly.
Hmm?
Bi-monthly.
Bi-monthly.
Every other month, yes.
And so there's a lot of dialogue going in there, and frankly, that might help you out a lot if you've got structural engineers in there with you, and you're saying, well, hey, we have this, and you've got a whole group of structural engineers going, well, yeah, that really should be that way. And I have heard of other items regarding that side of strict interpretation of code, and I know engineers who do things to go ahead and just get it passed through permit. They disagree too, but I've heard that on both the engineering and construction side. So my recommendation is just try and open up the communication path, get a good group of people together, and try and work through the differences that way. But I can't support this ordinance because it's too dangerous to the public, in my opinion.
Any other comments? I'm gonna say a couple. Mr. Steele, I'm sure if I get out of line, you'll stop on my feet here. So, being a builder in this town since 1976, and having a very personal relationship with the city, I'm gonna try to change your minds a little bit and see if I can do that. As Mr. Ferditas, you just stated, dialect, we meet with the building official once a month as an industry. We have been meeting with building officials once a month or 5 times a year since I can remember, starting back in 1981. And I can tell you, and I can show you documentation, that many of the issues that this industry brings before this administration are the same issues that we were battling since 1981. So it's a fruitless expenditure of time. Nothing seems to get accomplished, and I hear what you're saying, that the electrical, and they meet, and that's great, and I'm glad to hear that, because I did not know that. But there's many times I have served on this board for over 13, I think 14 years over the last 30, and I served on the ICC board for 11 years, the last 30, and I've seen how codes are introduced or passed, how they get in the code book. A lot of it's proprietary, a lot of it's self-serving interest. The codes have gone, I've tried to get someone to say it, but the codes have gone from protection of the occupants of the building to preservation of the building. I can give you example after example. One that strikes me real quick is in the Midwest, there's a section, a large section of the Midwest that you must use. It's in the code, a shingle that is hail-proof. Now, hail does not hurt people inside the structure, but it protects the structure with these shingles. So it's written in the code that you must use hail-proof shingles in a certain large area. So the costs get driven up, the costs get driven up. The $500 fee, I think, I've always said it's excessive. You mentioned also about, or someone did about, I wish there was more testimony from engineers, and this industry here meets with engineers. We held a meeting right in this room. And there was 6 or 8 engineers that came to that meeting. We were sitting up front. Nothing got accomplished at that meeting. Nothing got resolved. The engineers that deal with commercial, with residential, not so much commercial, are extremely frustrated with the system. They say so much, I wish there was an easier path to get it resolved. I wish we could find an easier method to go to the building board. Because being sitting on board, so we'll go to the building board. We don't have the time, and the building board is so heavily influenced by staff, and that we have been told, and I've been told over every year I've sat on this board, and you've been on it with me many, many years, is that you cannot go outside the letter of the code. We tried, and when Mr. Pauly was chairman, we tried on one case, and I think you can remember it, and we had it all fixed up, and Mr. Pauly reminded us that we could not go outside the letter of the code. So it makes it very, am I correct in that statement?
I'm not sure of the specifics.
Yeah, but
Your sense may be that, yeah.
But, so we've tried to find that gray as a board. We've tried to go out of it a little bit, and we keep getting pulled back in that you can't. And as a board member, I've actually gone to the mayor, both mayors, both Maestrom and Current, and said, why do we have a building board if we can't investigate or experiment with the gray? And never did get an answer from either one of them, by the way. But always asked. I like the resolution or the ordinance as Assemblyman Trombley has passed. I do not see this board being overburdened with appeals. I think the industry is busy enough on their own, so I do not see them just inundating this board with appeals. I think the industry, not just the residential, I think the engineers, once I think once the engineers learn that this is open and it has been passed, I think it'll start maybe getting staff to realize that, why don't we solve this? Why don't we look at the gray and solve it so that Mr. Taylor, Mr. Holman don't have to go to the building board? It may be an avenue where things will get resolved in more exponential manner. That's how I see this working. I don't see a lot of appeals coming. I see the staff sitting there saying, you know, they're just gonna go to the building board, and they may get it. So why don't we solve it before it goes there? I'm gonna vote in favor of it. If I'm the only one to vote in favor, so be it. But I think it's a good ordinance. I think Mr. Trombley I think he's researched it with the industry. I think he's done a good job there. And I think the reason you don't see more engineers and architects in the room, architects, we'll talk about architects, I've dealt with about 10 of them in the last 3 years. Every one of them said they'd use this if it was easier for access. I'm not gonna mention any names, I'll give it to you at a later date. Every one of them said that. So, I just think with a little more publication and a little more understanding of what this meeting was about, I think you would have seen a better attendance. For those reasons, I'm going to vote in favor of this and hope that my comments have changed some of your minds, maybe not, and I'm open for questions and any more comments from the board. Mr. Gray.
I'm going to go back to this, Mr. Trombley here, and I'm just looking at section 103.4.1, general, it continues on to section A. And it says the appeals panel, in order to hear, decide appeals, the members shall be qualified and experienced in training passed upon matters pertaining to the building, construction, service, equipment. And then in section 1, it says up to 5 hearing panels shall be established each year to hear appeals. Where are we to get these 15 people, because there's supposed to be 3 people on each panel?
Well, the 15 members are appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the assembly, at which point the chair and the secretary of the board has the ability to make those the 5 3-member panels.
Are there that many people standing in line to throw their name in the hat to sit on these panels, to be appointed?
Well, I can tell you from an assembly standpoint, we're always approving people or confirming people to certain bodies. But as of right now, if someone notices that the board is full, then why would they go and put their name in the hat for it? But when slots open up, there will be. On a regular basis, on an assembly meeting, we always approve somebody for a board or commission.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, did that answer your question, Mr. Gray?
Yes, it did. Comment, so the panels would be made up from members of this board?
That's correct. That's correct. The mayor appoints the 15 members to the building board of examiners and appeals. From those 15, the 5 3-member panels are then established.
Okay, I misunderstood people, and that's, I guess I misunderstood it then, because you're saying you want 3 people that are effective in that category. So if you had a plumbing issue, who would be the other 2 people to sit on that panel?
Well, obviously, you'd want an individual who works with plumbing, possibly a mechanical, maybe an electrical. I don't know. I can't give you specifics. I'm not a plumber. I'm not a mechanical guy. I'm not an electrician. You guys know your industry best. You'd be able to say, we have a plumbing appeal. Who deals with plumbing? Okay, obviously a plumber. Who else gets involved with plumbing? I don't know. That's why it's up to the to the chair of the board to determine that.
Mr. Gray, if I can just help you out here maybe, but on the makeup, if you look on the makeup, you have the makeup list of it. You know, so we have one mechanical engineer, one mechanical contractor, and one plumbing contractor. So there's three that would maybe know about plumbing, I don't know. I see the structural issues being more of a.
I was referring to that as an example.
Any other comments?
I have a comment.
Mr. Brinkman, go ahead.
I don't know if I agree with adding an extra layer to the appeal process. I do think there needs to be more access to our board, and I definitely would not be opposed to increasing the amount of membership to the board. I think that's probably a good idea. But we haven't had an appeal since 2007, and I would have to think that if there was any sort of remotely major issue whatsoever, we'd have seen at least one appeal. Maybe people don't think they have access to the appeal process, and they don't understand how to go about it. But I don't think the way this is written is going to give the desired effect that you guys that you're looking for. I deal with the municipality quite a bit, and I've been given variances. We work hand in hand with them, and we have a real positive outlook on how it's working right now. So I don't see the issues that you're seeing, but obviously there are issues, or we wouldn't have so much participation here at the meeting. I just don't know if this is the best way to solve the problem. I would be supportive of increasing the membership to maybe include more people from the residential industry, because it seems like that's what's driving this. I don't see that there's anything from the commercial industry or any participation where people have concerns. So I think maybe there needs to be more participation from the residential side. Maybe that would help bring some more appeals that feel comfortable coming in front of the board. I don't know, but I don't think, having a bunch of 3-member panels to review it, and if you don't get the desired effect to come to our committee, I think that extra layer, I don't see how that's gonna benefit the process. Hopefully that was clear enough.
Any other comments? Okay, so, a yes vote to the motion, and I'll repeat, go back to the motion, please. Mr. Steele motioned that the building board supports the language as written of AO-2012-19, when provided with written affirmation at the upcoming public hearing with the assembly. Mr. Boney seconded the motion. So with that being said, a yes vote would send a recommendation only, I believe is the word, a recommendation to the assembly in support of this ordinance, and a nay vote would send a denial from this board to the assembly. No?
It would do nothing.
Actually, it would do nothing, that's true. We would be sending no recommendation to the assembly. Thank you for that, Mr. Steele. Does everybody understand that? So a yes vote, we would be moving on a recommendation, and a nay would mean that this board takes no action on this. Okay, I'm sorry?
Chairman, I don't think that's what your motion said, so, the motion was moved to approve, and you had some additional language with it, so If you vote it up, it gets forwarded on to the assembly with that recommendation. If it gets voted down, it still gets forwarded on to the assembly with that, whatever your vote is on the motion.
But it shows the vote.
It shows the vote.
I agree with that.
Is that how you're reading it?
That's how it's written.
Deny motion.
What do your regulations say? Your regulations say that you send it on as a yes and you don't as a no?
Well, Mr. Tromley, what we have before them, as we brought the ordinance before the board for their deliberation, for their deliberative input, to be part of the public record, and we would make that available to the assembly.
Okay. I'm just curious as to why Mr. Steele said that there would be no action.
Well,
There's a reason behind that.
the
Is there-
no action is that we wouldn't be going forward saying we.
I got you.
support
Okay.
from that. That was what I was being told. Maybe we want to read the motion back, because the second sentence.
The way Madam Secretary has this, Mr. Steele motion, the building board supports the language of AO-2012-19 and provide written affirmation at the upcoming public hearing with the assembly. And Mr. Boney seconded. Does everybody understand the motion? Call the question, Madam Secretary.
Mr. Feller,
Nay.
Frieden,
No.
Straight,
Nay.
Mr. Steele,
No?
Mr. Merchant,
Yes.
Mr. Brigham,
No.
Mr. Gray,
No.
Mr. Michelson,
Yes.
Mr. Boonen.
No.
So there's 8 yeses and 2 nays. Is that correct?
Let's try this again.
No. I'm sorry. 8 nays and 2 yeses. I apologize for that. Is that correct?
No.
6, 7.
7-2.
There's 10 here, right?
No, we are missing Mr.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Madam Secretary, read us what it is. Read this.
Okay, there are 7 nays and 2 yeas.
No, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion. The building board affirms Part 23.10 of Title 23, also known as the Anchorage Administrative Code, and particularly 23.10.103.4, as effective and viable as currently adopted.
What page are you looking at? 23, what, I'm sorry?
That is the verbiage we got, page 404 of the staff memorandum.
What?
23.10.103.4. Basically, that's the current verbiage that was
Following duties of the building board, public examiners and appeals.
Yeah, it's on page, I guess in mine it says 9.
2310.
More staff. I was looking in the code, you said code. I'm sorry. You have a second for that motion? Second for Mr. Steele. So Mr. Frieden has made a motion in terms of Administrative Code 23.10. Should be .4, shouldn't it?
I don't think he's addressing.
Oh, Title 23, also known, as Anchorage Administrative Code, and particularly 23.10.103.4 as effective and viable as currently adopted. And it's been seconded by Mr. Steele. Yes, Mr. Friedman, go ahead.
Just basically, this motion, it would be nice if we could approach the assembly with a positive voted position from the board. And so since the previous version was denied, the previous motion was denied, this motion would say that the building board is comfortable with the current powers that the building board has. Now, I would say that this isn't saying that what is going on is right, as far as the appeal process and the apparent lack of access to the building board. But it would say that what we have right now is working. And I'll leave it at that and leave that open for discussion.
Any other comments, Mr. Steele?
Be supporting the motion. I apologize for not being better with forming motions, substitutes and the like. I formed the initial motion just in the positive vein. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the full support of not unfortunately, just the process has resulted in a negative vote on a motion. And I think the follow-up motion of Mr. Fredines is very appropriate. I think what staff has put together, I think the discussions and the deliberations have not overlooked that there is a segment of the community that does have a concern. And I hope that this does raise awareness and sensitivity, but I do think the process exists for these items to be resolved. And I think as a board, we do have the ability to interpret and maybe introduce differing perspectives. We certainly have to be able to support the reasoning for that in terms of law and the like. But I think in the past, on the ones I've sat in, we have reached some points like that. But I think that what is working or what's in place can work and can be improved upon. So I support the motion.
Mr. Fredine, you asking, if you look under the administrative code, or at least what we've been handed here, on page 9 of 34, it says 23.10.103.4.1 general, and then it goes on, I believe, to 23.1, page 9. This one here is. This is the Anchorage code that's in the packet also. And it goes on to 23.10.103.4.3. I think the building official has done an overview in her statement here. Do you want to include all this, or just stick with what you said here in the statement?
Well, by going to 103.4, it would include all subparagraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Which include your billing fee.
Do you want to do that, or you want to amend your motion just to include all the subparagraphs from 1 through 4? It's up to you, however.
I would, by leaving it at just .4, it should be inclusive. I would, if I would expand it beyond that, but by just leaving it at .4, that would ensure that it would be inclusive of all subs.
Okay. Any other comments? Seeing none, Madam Secretary, please call the question.
Okay. Mr. Feller?
Yes?
Mr. Frieden?
Yes.
Mr. Straight?
Yes.
Mr. Steele?
Yes.
Mr. Merchant?
Yeah.
Mr. Brigham?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Michelson?
I'd rather not, I'm going to abstain.
And Mr. Bone?
passes with
8.
8. Thank you. 8 yeas and 1 abstain. Thank you for that, Mr. Fedine. Anybody else want to comment per this? Any other board members want to make any comments to AO 201-2012-19 building board ordinance? Seeing none, case is closed. Thank you. I'd like to call about a 10-minute recess or 5-minute recess. How much time does everybody need?
What more we do?
We are still doing proposed changes to Administrative Code 23.10.105, clarify license requirements. 5-6 minutes adequate, gentlemen? 5-6 minute recess. Special orders business, item number B, proposed changes to Administrative Code 23.10.105. The intent, I believe, is to clarify license requirements. Ms. Walsh, will you give us a summary of that, please?
Yes, I'm going to have Mr.
Mr. Knopf.
Mr.
I've only worked for about a year and a half.
It's a tough name.
He's going to present this particular.
Mr. Nosson?
Mr. Nosson.
Okay, for me personally, this is kind of an embarrassing little proposed ordinance. This is basically fixing kind of a hole or a problem that we found in the Anchorage Administrative Code. And probably the single most significant thing that this does is it creates a $1,000, what I'd like to call handyman exemption. So right now, under the Anchorage Administrative Code, there's really no dollar amount exemption that would allow someone to do work who's not appropriately licensed in that trade. You know what I'm saying? They would have to be licensed as a contractor in order to do any work. In the state code, there's kind of like a $10,000 exemption where you can do handyman work. But we don't have that in the Anchorage Administrative Code. So that's probably the single most significant thing we've put in here. And then in addition to that, we've basically tried to clarify the licensing requirements in the Anchorage Administrative Code by actually listing all the general contractors, electrical, plumbing, mechanical contractor, and all the specialty contractor trades. And what we've done is we basically just matched the state of Alaska's requirements.
Thank you for that. Any comments from Mr.? I always screw your name up.
Knopfsinger?
Nossinger.
Knopfsinger, 2 F's.
Nossinger. I always say Nossinger. Nossinger. Sorry about that. Any? Yes, Mr.
Hey,
Murchie.
Ron.
In regards to that, I want to make sure I understand that, is in regards to, you said electrical and plumbing or mechanical contract, does that apply to them? Meaning that $1,000 would apply?
No, good question. So when you go and read the first exception there on the second page of the proposed ordinance, it basically says that this exception does not apply to electrical, plumbing, and mechanical work which shall be administered by contractors licensed in accordance with state law in this code. And there's a similar exception under the performing work part of it too. There's 2 pieces to this. There's contracting and then there's performing work.
Okay, thank you, Ron.
I think you just answered it. So a handyman or an individual, except doing work on specific residence, cannot perform any electrical, mechanical, or plumbing.
Correct.
Anybody here to testify in this? Please come up, state your name, and spell your last name, please, for the record again. Madam Secretary, do we need to spell the last name again? Or-
No.
Okay.
Chuck Holman, Holman Incorporated, modeling contractor, and past president 2 years ago of the Anchorage Home Builders Association. And I just want to really say, I appreciate the staff and working on this and putting this together. It's something that we've been working with the building department for many years, and a former building official, Ron Thompson, had drafted something similar, and so we finally, kind of bringing this to a conclusion here. I think this is really important that for the consumers out there that are getting a lot of small jobs done, there's a lot of unlicensed contractors out there that are easily accessible through Craigslist, and we're seeing a lot of homeowners getting burned by these individuals that they're hiring that are unlicensed. And right now, obviously, with the state of Alaska has $10,000 out there for energy retrofit work. Other than the mechanical, a lot of that is being done by unlicensed contractors. And what has been the policy of the department in the past was that, at least my understanding was, if no permit was required, no contractor's license was required. So when Mark Barnhill went out and found somebody unlicensed, he would turn them over to the state, and the city would take no action against the individual doing contracting work because no permit was required. This now gives the department the ability to enforce licensing on these individuals that are doing contracting work. And with the energy upgrade, a lot of it is replacing windows, and knowing the code, and no permits required to replace your windows in your house, but putting in egress windows. And we go out there to people's homes and see new windows put in, but they're not egress, and having knowledge of safety glass and safety glazing in the correct areas. Lead-based paint is now a big issue, and these people need to be licensed with EPA also. And recently we've had numerous meetings with the city officials and state officials on the stormwater runoff rules. And we've had the builders and developers and government officials sitting at the table at the home builder's office. One of the biggest issues that the developers have is the landscape contractors, and going out there and screwing up their drainage plan and not complying with the stormwater runoff rules. And the landscape contractors generally are unlicensed in the city. And this clearly brings those guys into the licensing process. The landscape contractor will now need to be licensed, bonded, insured, and that developer or the homeowner who has their drainage problem screwed up. And that's one of the biggest complaints this department, I think, has, that I've been told, is drainage issues with homeowners. These landscape contractors will now be licensed and will be insured and bonded, so there's something to go back to. So I think from a consumer standpoint, this is a real positive thing.
Any questions of Mr. Holman? I just have one for clarification, Mr. Holman. You said that in the past it's been turned over to the state. In your recollection, hasn't the state indicated on numerous times that they did not have the staff to enforce the law? And that's why it's been running amok?
Yes, the state has just a couple of people in the enforcement, and they're assigned, South Central, we got just 2 people really that are working contractor licensing along with their other duties of mechanical inspections. It's handled by the state mechanical inspectors, contractor licensing, and so they're very limited, and they're trying to do the enforcement in Anchorage, Kenai, Wasilla, with just a couple of people. So this gives our local department, I think, more power to enforce our licensing.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Again, Cody Lee, CODY, LEE, current president of the Anchorage Home Builders, past co-chair of the Remodelers Council and a remodeling contractor here in town. It's good to be on the same side as building safety with this, and they've worked really hard to get this ordinance together, and I think it's a real good step in the right direction. We've kind of had this industry out there running that is not following the code. There's really no consumer protection there against these guys. There was just there's been articles in the paper, everything else about unlicensed contractors and just how loose this has been. And so it's nice to see, to start to kind of close this loophole that's been out there that these guys have been working under for quite some time. As a residential remodeler, it's hard to, you just can't compete with these folks. They're hiring employees, they're not carrying workers' comp. All that stuff that we pay for eventually, because when those guys are out on working on somebody's home and they get hurt, it either goes on your homeowners in policy, or they wind up on some kind of a state program. So some way, the honest individuals wind up paying for all this stuff that's out there. And it's just, with this $10,000 that's out there, it's created a whole industry of people working under the table, not paying taxes. And it's not just replacing windows. There's a ton of guys out there running around replacing boilers and furnaces and all that kind of stuff too. So it goes the whole gambit. Once they get in there, it's a doorway for them to start doing other things. And they're unlicensed, no liability. If they decide to go away, they just disappear, and there's no recourse for the consumer. So at least with some licensing, it gives the city a way to enforce this and keep some control of this. As Chuck said, multiple times we go into homes and people has new windows and they're not egress, or there's not safety glass. And if we're going to pull a permit, then we're stuck with telling the homeowner, hey, we're going to be in the bedroom, we got to change these out, these aren't legal, we got to do it. And it's just a bad situation. And I'm for permitting, and the process works well. It's just this loophole needs to be closed up.
Any questions to Mr. Lee? Just so the board understands it, Mr. Lee, are you familiar with the case where a unlicensed handyman performed over $100,000 worth of work on one house, and he did it with multiple invoices of less than $9,000 an invoice?
I've heard of several instances like that. I can't think of one right off the top of my head, but there's been several instances where they've played that game. I mean, a lot of these guys are very well educated with the system, and they know how to work the system quite well.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Any other testimony? You haven't testified before, so if I could ask you to please spell your last name.
Doug Steffen, S-T-E-F-F-E-N. I'm with Tailored Restoration, co-chair of the Remodelers Council. And just to tag on what these guys have said, staff has been a great help in putting this together. Appreciate that. And I guess not to cover what they've already covered, but this stuff's real. I mean, my organization goes to 3 or 4 of these a month where people have hired somebody and they just do egregious work. I mean, handrails that are down around your knees for an older woman. I mean, she fell because of it. There's just, it constantly goes on. You don't hear about it all in the newspaper. And this is baby step. You know, this is going to solve the problem completely. Enforcement's going to be a big part of it. But I just want you folks to know it's real, and I support it.
Thank you for your testimony. Any questions of Mr. Steffen? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Yes?
David Doolin, Data Construction. I don't have a lot to add to that. I just want to throw my hat in with that. This is I mean, it is an issue for contractors. It's a dollars and cents issue as far as trying to compete against these people that are just not playing by the same rules that we're obligated to play with. But also, I want to compliment staff. I think this is a step in very much the right direction. I'm a little concerned about the enforcement. I think, from what I've heard about Mark Barnhill and his efforts there, he brought a lot of money in terms of fines and things like that. And so this strikes me that along with this change, there needs to be serious consideration given to the enforcement of it, and I think it's self-supporting and probably would be.
Thank you, Mr. Doolin. Any questions from the board? Mr. Doolin? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Any other people want to testify? testifying session is closed at this point in time. It's open to the board. I seek a motion for a action on this proposed change to Administration Code 23.10.105. I look to Mr. Steele.
Before making a motion, if I could ask a question of staff.
Please.
Obviously, this is abbreviated since there isn't portions of it changed. But comparing that to the handout we received tonight, I'm a little confused with, I see C reverting to B for performance of work. We have exception 1. Then we have exception 2. The property owner may perform work as follows. So you've added one exception, and then you're just numbering 1A through C as 2A through C, and 2 becomes 3, and...
Yeah, I mean, basically,
I just want to make sure that...
okay, yeah, the original paragraph A for this section, we realized was redundant, so we deleted that, so all the paragraphs ended up being renumbered. I shifted them, and then we added the exception, so that shifted that numbering.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mr. Steele?
I move for approval of Anchorage ordinance number 2012 as written. Second.
Just a clarification, it's not numbered yet, but it will.
Right,
We'll put the ordinance.
2012 dash, and what it is for clarification, an ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code Section 2310-105 to clarify contractor license requirements, list construction specialties that require a municipal license, and to create exceptions for work having a total construction valuation under $1,000.
Do you still second the motion, Mr. Gregg?
Yes, Chairman.
Motion's been made, it's been seconded, and if I can get it right, it's a motion to approve AO number 2012, no number yet, and then it's, everybody can read it, it's line 1 through 5. It's been motioned and seconded, and I call for the question, please. Well, I'm gonna hold off comments to the motion. See, I would just like to make one, I kind of bashed the staff a few minutes ago with the last testimony. I do want to tell you, I appreciate all your help and effort that you put into this. It's a long time coming, and you've worked very diligently on it, and I think the entire industry is going to benefit from this, and I too want to thank you for all the work that you put into it, including you, Mr. Nuss. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Madam Secretary, can you please call the question now?
Mr. Keller?
Yes?
Mr. Frieden?
Yes.
Mr. Straight?
Yes.
Mr. Steele?
Yes.
Mr. Merchant?
Yes.
Mr. Brigham?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Michelson?
Yes.
Mr. Booney?
Yes.
Motion's been approved.
If I can just add on so everyone knows, now that you have approved the language, we've already been through legal on this. This is a product of their work and our work together. So at this point tomorrow, we'll take it, put it into the PACE system, which gets it on the assembly calendar, which probably means the meeting of the 13th of March would be introduced. So that would be introduced the 13th of March, and then public hearing would normally be set 2 weeks after that, the 27th of March. So
Ms. Walsh, are you gonna, if and when the assembly takes action on it, are you gonna ask for immediate
that would be, yeah, immediate action that night,
Action.
public hearing, and then.
But I mean, it'll take effect immediate next day, or are you gonna ask
See how it
for?
works.
So you're not gonna ask for a grace period of 6 months, or?
No, we talked that through, about, what do you do about the person who just really doesn't know? And, current code does allow us to waive the first fine, the fine for first offense in terms of licensing. And so that will be the education process. If someone gets written up, they'll have one time where okay, it's now been brought to your attention, we will waive this fine for your first offense as long as you get your license within the next number of days. And that will be the education process. We determined it was already in there, so we didn't burden the ordinance with a bunch of other language.
And are you gonna have the staff ability to enforce this, or would you like to see this board make a recommendation to assembly that you possibly, I mean, you're always looking for new people
We
anyway.
would love to have more people. As at this point, for the summary of economic effects, if you read it, at this point, we'll absorb it with regular duties, meaning when one of the folks from the safety inspectors is out and he sees, Joe's handyman's truck, doing something, he'll be entitled to stop and ask them if they have a license to do what they're doing. Whereas present, if he only sees them doing, say, a window, he can't necessarily, or hasn't necessarily been stopping. We feel in reality, the requirement's always been there, and that's what industry sort of pointed out to us, and that's, that's why we felt it was important to clarify. So if there's more, but Mr. Barnhill only has so many hours in his day, Mr. Wisdom's only so many hours in his day. So they have the tool now, the clear tool to do what they need to do, but more people would always help.
So I ask again, would it, I don't even know if we can do it. I think we can make any recommendation we want, somebody doesn't have to listen to us. But would it be beneficial if we made a recommendation that one more staff person was hired to enforce this?
Mr. Chairman, we've worked with administration for considerable period of time to get adequate resourcing, and if we don't have sufficient resources, we will ask for additional resources.
To make a comment, although it's not their, the primary duty is doing is inspections, but the inspectors also have the authority, to stop and write up, and I know that specific to plumbing and mechanical, my inspectors do that on a regular basis. They'll write them up and then they'll give the copy to Mark, he'll follow through with it, so.
I suspected that to be true, that's why I didn't ask that question.
I'm sorry?
I suspected that to be true,
Yeah.
that's why I didn't, it's gonna give them more power to be able to stop
I
that.
mean, when we're busier in the summer, we don't have as much opportunity to do that, but, during the slower months, when a lot of this work goes on, we do, and we will.
And we do, if I can add to that, we do respond to complaints. We will respond to complaints, so if, some of our best inspectors are competitors of the guys out there. I mean, we hear, someone's on a roof, I don't think they've got a license, we'll go check it out. And we can't be everywhere, but we can respond to that kind of a complaint.
Excellent, thank you for all the comments. Item number 4, special orders business is now complete. Looking at item number 5, board member comments, are there any from the board? Quiet board tonight. The next meeting will be March 29th, 2012, 6:30 to 9 o'clock p.m. at our regular meeting place at Lusac Library. At that point in time, we will also be holding our annual vote on the chair and the vice chair position. And is there a case coming before us on the 29th?
At this time, we don't have any, this will be a regular business meeting, and to introduce the new members, we go through the rules of procedure, which you all should have now, we send them to you as part of this packet, for the advance information last week. So if there's any questions about rules of procedure, that'll be the meeting to kind of talk them all through.
Okay, excellent. I would like to welcome those that are new to the board, and I know Mr. Merchant's new. Mr. Straight's new, Mr. Gray is new. I believe that's it, isn't it? The rest of the guys I've seen around. I welcome you guys, enjoyed your input tonight. With that, I'm looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
You've been awful quiet. We have a motion and a second, and I'm sure everybody's in favor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it sounds like we should come to
Thanks for being on that.
Sure, guys. It's on the same side of the table, but it's good to be, and it's much more fun when we are. You know? Everybody kind of wants to get to the same places as how you get there.
Seamlessly as possible, too.
You know, I just went by several
Works better on this residential structural stuff. The plan reviewers have their side of it, and the design people have their side of it. There's differences.
Good evening.
Good building.